The Doolittle Raid, also known as Doolittle's Raid, as well as the Tokyo Raid, was an air raid on 18 April 1942 by the United States on the Japanese capital Tokyo and other places on Honshu during World War II. It was the first American air operation to strike the Japanese archipelago. Although the raid caused comparatively minor damage, it demonstrated that the Japanese mainland was vulnerable to American air attacks. It served as an initial retaliation for the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and provided an important boost to American morale. The raid was named after Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, who planned and led the attack. It was one of 6 American carrier raids against Japan and Japanese-held territories conducted in the first half of 1942. Under the final plan, 16 B-25B Mitchell medium bombers, each with a crew of 5, were launched from the U.S. Navy aircraft carrier USS Hornet in the Pacific Ocean. There were no fighter escorts. After bombing the military and industrial targets, the crews were to continue westward to land in China. On the ground, the raid killed around 50 people and injured 400. Damage to Japanese military and industrial targets was minimal, but the raid had major psychological effects. In the United States, it raised morale. In Japan, it raised fear and doubt about the ability of military leaders to defend the home islands, but the bombing and strafing of civilians created a desire for retribution. This was exploited for propaganda purposes. 4. The raid also pushed forward Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plans to attack Midway Island in the Central Pacific, an attack that turned into a decisive defeat of the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, by the U.S. Navy in the Battle of Midway. The consequences of the Doolittle raid were most severely felt in China. In reprisal for the raid, the Japanese launched the Zhejiangjiangxi campaign, killing 250,005 civilians and 70,000 soldiers. 4-2. Of the 16 crews involved, 14 returned to the United States or reached the safety of American forces, though 1 man was killed while bailing out. 6, 7, 8 men were captured by Japanese forces in eastern China, the other 2 crew members having drowned in the sea, and 3 of them were later executed. All but 1 of the 16 B-25s were destroyed in crashes, while 1 of the planes landed at Vladivostok in the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union was not officially at war with Japan, it was required, under international law, to intern the crew for the duration of the war. The crew's B-25 was also confiscated. However, within a year, the crew was secretly allowed to leave the Soviet Union under the guise of an escape. They returned to the United States or to American units elsewhere by way of Allied-occupied Iran and North Africa. Doolittle initially believed that he would be court-martialed for missing his primary targets. Instead, he received the Medal of Honor and was promoted 2 ranks to Brigadier General. Background: Doolittle raid targets and landing fields. President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in a meeting at the White House on 21 December 1941 and said that Japan should be bombed as soon as possible to boost public morale after Pearl Harbor. Doolittle recounted in his autobiography that the raid was intended to bolster American morale and to cause the Japanese to begin doubting their leadership. An attack on the Japanese homeland would cause confusion in the minds of the Japanese people and sow doubt about the reliability of their leaders. Americans badly needed a morale boost. 10. The concept for the attack came from Navy Captain Francis S. Lowe, Assistant Chief of Staff for Anti-Submarine Warfare. He reported to Admiral Ernest J. King on 10 January 1942 that he thought that twin-engined Army bombers could be launched from an aircraft carrier, after observing several at Naval Station Norfolk Chambers Field in Norfolk, where the runway was painted with the outline of a carrier deck for landing. Doolittle, a famous military test pilot, civilian aviator, and aeronautical engineer before the war, was assigned to Army Air Force's headquarters to plan the raid. The aircraft to be used would need a cruising range of 2,400 nautical miles, 4,400 km, with a 2,000-pound 910 kg bomb load. Doolittle considered the B-25B Mitchell, Martin B-26 Marauder, Douglas B-18 Bolo, and Douglas B-23 Dragon. 12. The B-26 had questionable takeoff characteristics from a carrier deck. The wingspans of the B-18 and B-23 were larger than that of the B-25, reducing the number that could be taken aboard a carrier and posing risks to the ship's superstructure. 13. The B-25 had yet to see combat and had a range of about 1,300 miles, but tests indicated that it could fulfill the mission's requirements if it were modified to hold nearly twice as much fuel. Note 114. Doolittle's first report on the plan suggested that the bombers fly to Vladivostok after their attack, where they could be handed to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. This stratagem was intended to circumvent Moscow's April 1941 neutrality pact with Japan. 15. But Soviet officials refused. 16. Instead, planners looked to China, adding some 600 nautical miles, 1,100 km to the flight. Despite concerns about Japanese reprisals, Chiang Kai-shek agreed to provide 5 refueling sites and a final destination, Chongqing. 17. No fighter escort was possible, for no fighter aircraft with the required range were available. Citation needed. Preparation. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle wires a Japanese Friendship Medal to a bomb for return to its originators. After planning indicated that the B-25 best met the mission's requirements, 2 were loaded aboard the aircraft carrier USS Hornet at Norfolk and were flown off the deck without difficulty on 3 February 1942. 18. The raid was immediately approved. The crews would be drawn from the 17th Bombardment Group, Medium, which had been the first group to receive B-25s and had become the most experienced B-25 unit in the service. All 4 of its squadrons flew the bomber by September 1941. Its first assignment after the United States entered the war was to the U.S. 8th Air Force. 19. The 17th BG, then flying anti-submarine patrols from Pendleton, Oregon, was immediately moved cross-country to Columbia Army Air Base at West Columbia, South Carolina, ostensibly to fly similar patrols off the east coast of the United States, but in actuality to prepare for the mission against Japan. The group officially transferred effective 9 February 1942 to Columbia, where its combat crews were offered the opportunity to volunteer for an extremely hazardous but unspecified mission. On 19 February, the group was detached from the 8th Air Force and assigned to III Bomber Command. 20. Initial planning called for 20 aircraft to fly the mission. 21 and 24 of the group's B-25B Mitchell bombers were diverted to the Mid-Continent Airlines Modification Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota. With support provided by 2 senior airline managers, Wold Chamberlain Field's maintenance hangar was the first modification center to become operational. From nearby Fort Snelling, the 710th Military Police Battalion provided tight security around this hangar. B-25B aircraft modifications included removal of the lower gun turret, installation of de-icers and anti-icers, mounting of steel blast plates on the fuselage around the upper turret, removal of the liaison radio set to save weight, installation of a 160 U.S. gallon, 610 L, 130 imp gal, collapsible neoprene auxiliary fuel tank, fixed to the top of the bomb bay, and installation of support mounts for additional fuel cells in the bomb bay, crawlway, and lower turret area, to increase fuel capacity from 646 to 1,141 U.S. gallons, 538 to 950 imperial gallons, or 2,445 to 4,319 L. Installation of broomsticks as mock gun barrels in the tail cone. Replacement of the Norden bomb site with a makeshift aiming site devised by pilot Capt. C. Ross Greening. Dubbed the Mark Twain, its materials cost just 20 cents, 19. Two bombers also had cameras mounted to record the results of the bombing, 16. The 24 crews were selected and picked up the modified bombers in Minneapolis and flew them to Eglin Field, Florida, beginning 1 March 1942. There, the crews received concentrated training for 3 weeks in simulated carrier deck takeoffs, low-level and night flying, low-altitude bombing and overwater navigation, operating primarily out of Eglin Auxiliary Field 1, a more secluded site. Lieutenant Henry L. Miller, a U.S. Navy flight instructor from nearby Naval Air Station Pensacola, supervised their takeoff training and accompanied the crews to the launch. For his efforts, Miller is considered an honorary member of the Raider Group, 22. Doolittle stated in his after-action report that the crews reached a safely operational level of training, despite several days when flying was not possible because of rain and fog. One aircraft was written off in a landing accident on 10 March 2324, and another was heavily damaged in a takeoff accident on 23 March 2324, while a third was removed from the mission because of a nose wheel shimmy that could not be repaired in time. 16. On 25 March 1942, the remaining 22 B-25s took off from Eglin for McClellan Field, California. They arrived 2 days later at the Sacramento Air Depot for inspection and final modifications. 5 crews did extra training on March 30 and 31 at the Willows Glen County Airport. 25. A total of 16 B-25s were flown to Naval Air Station Alameda on 31 March. 15 made up the mission force, and the 16th, by last-minute agreement with the Navy, was loaded so that it could be launched shortly after departure from San Francisco to demonstrate to the Army pilots that there was sufficient deck space for a safe takeoff. Instead, that bomber was made part of the mission force. Note 227. On 1 April 1942, the 16 modified bombers, their 5-man crews, and Army maintenance personnel, totaling 71 officers and 130 enlisted men, note 42128, were loaded onto Hornet at Naval Air Station Alameda in California. Each aircraft carried 4 specially constructed 500-pound, 230 kg bombs. 3 of these were high-explosive munitions, and 1 was a bundle of incendiaries. The incendiaries were long tubes, wrapped together to be carried in the bomb bay, but designed to separate and scatter over a wide area after release. 5 bombs had Japanese Friendship medals wired to them, medals awarded by the Japanese government to U.S. servicemen before the war. 30. The bomber's armament was reduced to increase range by decreasing weight. Each bomber launched with 2.50 caliber, 12.7 machine guns in an upper turret and a .30 caliber, 7.62 machine gun in the nose. The aircraft were clustered closely and tied down on Hornet's flight deck in the order of launch. Hornet and Task Force 18 got underway from San Francisco Bay at 08:48 on 2 April with the 16 bombers in clear view. 31 at noon the next day. Parts to complete modifications that had not been finished at McClellan were lowered to the forward deck of Hornet by Navy blimp L-8. 32 a few days later, the carrier met with Vice Admiral William Halsey Jr.'s Task Force 16. The carrier USS Enterprise and her escort of cruisers and destroyers in the mid-Pacific Ocean north of Hawaii. If the Japanese attacked, Enterprise's fighters and scout planes would protect the task force, since Hornet's fighters were stowed below decks to make space for the B-25s. The combined force was 2 carriers, Hornet and Enterprise, 3 heavy cruisers, Salt Lake City, Northampton, Vincennes, 1 light cruiser, Nashville, 8 destroyers, Bouch, Fanning, Benham, Ellet, Gwynn, Meredith, Grayson, Monson, and 2 fleet oilers, Cimarron and Sabine. The ships proceeded in radio silence. On the afternoon of 17 April, the slow oilers refueled the task force. then withdrew with the destroyers to the east while the carriers and cruisers dashed west at 20 knots, 37 km/h, 23 mph, toward their intended launch point in enemy-controlled waters east of Japan. 33. Orders in hand, Navy Captain Mark Mitcher, skipper of USS Hornet, chats with LT Col James Doolittle. At 07:38 on the morning of 18 April, while the task force was still about 650 nautical miles, 1,200 km, 750 mi, from Japan, around 35 degrees N 154 degrees E, it was sighted by the Japanese picket boat No. 23 Nidomaru, a 70-ton patrol craft, which radioed an attack warning to Japan. 34. The boat was sunk by gunfire from Nashville. Note 5. The chief petty officer who captained the boat killed himself rather than be captured, but 5 of the 11 crew were picked up by Nashville. 36. Doolittle and Hornet skipper Captain Mark Mitcher decided to launch the B-25s immediately, 10 hours early and 170 nautical miles, 310 km, 200 mi, farther from Japan than planned. Note 6. After responding to allow for engine start and run-ups, Doolittle's aircraft had 467 feet, 142 m of takeoff distance. 37. Although none of the B-25 pilots, including Doolittle, had ever taken off from a carrier before, all 16 aircraft launched safely between 08:20 and 09:19. Though Doolittle's bomber was witnessed to have almost hit the water before pulling up at the last second, the B-25s then flew toward Japan, most in groups of 2 to 4 aircraft, before flying singly at wave-top level to avoid detection. 38. The aircraft began arriving over Japan about noon Tokyo time, 6 hours after launch, climbed to 1,500 feet, 460 m, and bombed 10 military and industrial targets in Tokyo, 2 in Yokohama, and 1 each in Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. Although some B-25s encountered light anti-aircraft fire and a few enemy fighters, made up of Ki-45s and prototype Ki-61, the latter being mistaken for Bf-109s, over Japan, no bomber was shot down. Only the B-25 of 1st Lt. Richard O. Joyce received any battle damage, minor hits from anti-aircraft fire. 37 B-25 No. 4, piloted by 1st Lt. Everett W. Hallstrom, jettisoned its bombs before reaching its target when it came under attack by fighters after its gun turret malfunctioned. 39. The Americans claimed to have shot down 3 Japanese fighters, one by the gunners of the Whirling Dervish, piloted by 1st Lt. Harold Watson, and 2 by the gunners of the Harikariur, piloted by 1st Lt. Ross Greening. Many targets were strafed by the bomber's nose gunners. The subterfuge of the simulated gun barrels mounted in the tail cones was described afterwards by Doolittle as effective, in that no airplane was attacked directly from behind. 16. One of the Doolittle raiders launching, 18 April 1942. 15 of the 16 aircraft then proceeded southwest off the southeastern coast of Japan and across the East China Sea toward eastern China. 1 B-25, piloted by Captain Edward J. York, was extremely low on fuel and headed instead for the Soviet Union rather than be forced to ditch in the middle of the East China Sea. Several fields in Zhejiang province were supposed to be ready to guide them in using homing beacons, then recover and refuel them for continuing on to Chongqing, the wartime Kuomintang capital. 21. The primary base was at Jeju, toward which all the aircraft navigated, but Halsey never sent the planned signal to alert them, apparently because of a possible threat to the task force. Note 740. The raiders faced several unforeseen challenges during their flight to China. Night was approaching, the aircraft were running low on fuel, and the weather was rapidly deteriorating. None would have reached China if not for a tail wind as they came off the target, which increased their ground speed by 25 kn, 46 km/h, 29 mph, For 7 hours, 41, the crews realized they would probably not be able to reach their intended bases in China, leaving them the option of either bailing out over eastern China or crash landing along the Chinese coast. Note 816. All 15 aircraft reached the Chinese coast after 13 hours of flight and crash-landed or the crews bailaed out. One crewman, 20-year-old Corporal Leland D. Factor, flight engineer gunner with 1st LT, Robert M. Gray, was killed during his bailout attempt over China, the only man in that crew to be lost. 2 crews, 10 men were missing. The 16th aircraft, commanded by Capt. Edward York, 8th Off. AC-42-242, flew to the Soviet Union and landed 40 miles, 64 km, beyond Vladivostok at Vozdvizhenka. As the USSR was not at war with Japan, and the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact was officially in force, the Soviet government was officially unable to immediately repatriate any Allied personnel involved in hostilities who entered Soviet territory. Furthermore, at the time, the Soviet Far East was vulnerable to military action by Japanese forces. Consequently, in accordance with international law, the crew members were interned, despite official U.S. requests for their release, and the B-25 was impounded. York would later report that he and his crew had been treated well by the Soviet authorities. Several months later, they were moved to Ashgabat, in what was then the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic, 20 miles, 32 km, from the Soviet-Iranian border. In mid-1943, they were allowed to cross the border into Allied-occupied Iran. The Americans presented themselves to a British consulate on 11 May 1943. 6-7. A cover story was concocted that York had bribed a smuggler to assist them in escaping from Soviet custody. The fact that the smuggling had been staged by the NKVD was later confirmed by declassified Soviet archives. 42. Doolittle and his crew, after parachuting into China, received assistance from Chinese soldiers and civilians, as well as John Birch, an American missionary in China. As did the others who participated in the mission, Doolittle had to bail out, but he landed in a heap of dung, saving a previously injured ankle from breaking in a paddy in China near Kwazhou. The mission was the longest ever flown in combat by the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, averaging about 2,250 nautical miles, 4,170 km. Aftermath. This section needs additional citations for verification. Please help improve this article by adding citations to reliable sources in this section. Unsourced material may be challenged and removed. April 2017. Learn how and when to remove this message. Fate of the missing crewmen. Call Doolittle with members of his flight crew and Chinese officials in China after the attack. From left to right, Staff SGT. Fred A. Bremer, Bombardier, Staff SGT. Paul J. Leonard, Flight Engineer Gunner, Ko Fukai, Secretary of the Western Chekiang Province Branch Government, 1st LT. Richard E. Cole, Co-Pilot Doolittle, Henry H. Shen, Bank Manager, LT. Henry A. Potter, Navigator, General Ho, Director of the Branch Government of Western Chekiang Province. Following the Doolittle raid, most of the B-25 crews who had reached China eventually found safety with the help of Chinese civilians and soldiers. Of the 16 planes and 80 airmen who participated in the raid, all either crash-landed, were ditched, or crashed after their crews bailaid out, with the single exception of Capt. York and his crew, who landed in the Soviet Union. Despite the loss of these 15 aircraft, 69 airmen escaped capture or death, with only 3 killed in action. When the Chinese helped the Americans escape, the grateful Americans in turn gave them whatever they had on hand. Clarification needed. The people who helped them paid dearly for sheltering the Americans. Most of them were tortured and executed for giving aid. During the search, an estimated 250,000 Chinese lives were taken by the Japanese Imperial Army. 8 raiders were captured. Some of the men who crashed were aided by Patrick Cleary, the Irish Bishop of Nanchang. The Japanese troops retaliated by burning down the city. 43. The crews of 2 aircraft, 10 men in total, were unaccounted for, those of 1st LT. Dean E. Hallmark, 6th off, and 1st LT. William G. Farrow, last off. On 15 August 1942, the United States learned from the Swiss Consulate General in Shanghai that 8 of the missing crew members were prisoners of the Japanese at the city's police headquarters. 2 of the missing crewmen, Bombardier S/SGT, William J. Dieter, and Flight Engineer SGT. Donald E. Fitzmaurice of Hallmark's crew, were found to have drowned when their B-25 crashed into the sea. Both of their remains were recovered after the war and were buried with military honors at Golden Gate National Cemetery. The other 8 were captured, 1st LT. Dean E. Hallmark, 1st LT, William G. Farrow, 1st LT, Robert J. Metter, 1st LT, Chase Nielsen, 1st LT, Robert L. Height, 2nd LT, George Barr, CPL, Harold A. Spatz, and CPL, Jacob DeShazer. All 8 captured in Jiangxi were tried and sentenced to death at a military trial in China, and then transported to Tokyo. There the Army Ministry reviewed their case, with 5 of the sentences being commuted and the other 3 being executed. 44 out of the 80 crewmen, 3 were killed in action, 8 were captured, and 3 were killed in captivity by the Japanese. The surviving captured airmen remained in military confinement on a starvation diet, their health rapidly deteriorating. In April 1943, they were moved to Nanjing, where Metter died on 1 December 1943. The remaining men, Nielsen, Height, Barr, and DeShazer, eventually began receiving slightly better treatment and were given a copy of the Bible and a few other books. They were freed by American troops in August 1945. 4 Japanese officers were tried for war crimes against the captured Doolittle raiders, found guilty, and sentenced to hard labor, 3 for 5 years and 1 for 9 years. Barr had been near death when liberated and remained in China recuperating until October, by which time he had begun to experience severe emotional problems. Untreated after transfer to Letterman Army Hospital and a military hospital in Clinton, Iowa, Barr became suicidal and was held virtually incommunicado until November, when Doolittle's personal intervention resulted in treatment that led to his recovery. 45. DeShazer graduated from Seattle Pacific University in 1948 and returned to Japan as a missionary, where he served for over 30 years. 46. When their remains were recovered after the war, Farrow, Hallmark, and Metter were buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Spatz was buried with military honors at National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. Of the surviving prisoners, Barr died of heart failure in 1967, Nielsen in 2007, DeShazer on 15 March 2008, and the last, Height, died 29 March 2015, service of the returning crewmen. Doolittle receiving the Medal of Honor in 1942 from President Roosevelt in a ceremony attended by Standing L.R.L.T. Gen. H. Arnold, Josephine Doolittle, and Gen. George C. Marshall. Immediately following the raid, Doolittle told his crew that he believed the loss of all 16 aircraft, coupled with the relatively minor damage to targets, had rendered the attack a failure, and that he expected a court-martial upon his return to the United States. 47. Instead, the raid bolstered American morale. Doolittle was promoted 2 grades to brigadier general on 28 April while still in China, skipping the rank of colonel, and was presented with the Medal of Honor by Roosevelt upon his return to the United States in June. When General Doolittle toured the growing Eglin Field facility in July 1942 with commanding officer Carl Grandison Gardner, the local paper of record, the Okaloosa News-Journal, Crestview, Florida, while reporting his presence, made no mention of his still-secret recent training at Eglin. He went on to command the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean, and the 8th Air Force in England during the next 3 years. An injured pilot receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross at Walter Reed Hospital from Maj. Gen. Millard F. Harmon in 1942, All 80 raiders were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, and those who were killed or wounded during the raid were awarded the Purple Heart. Every Doolittle raider was also decorated by the Chinese government. In addition, Corporal David J. Thatcher, a flight engineer gunner on Lawson's crew, and First Lt. Thomas R. White, flight surgeon gunner with Smith, were awarded the Silver Star for helping the wounded crew members of Lt. Lawson's crew to evade Japanese troops in China. Finally, as Doolittle noted in his autobiography, he successfully insisted that all of the raiders receive a promotion, full citation needed. 28 of the crewmen remained in the China-Burma-India theater, including the entire crews of planes 4, 10, and 13, flying missions, most for more than a year. 5 were killed in action. Note 948, 19 crew members flew combat missions in the Mediterranean theater after returning to the United States, 4 of whom were killed in action and 4 becoming prisoners of war. Note 10, 9 crew members served in the European theater of operations. 1 was killed in action, and 1, David M. Davy Jones, was shot down and became a POW in Stalag Luft III at Sagan, where he played a part in the Great Escape. 49 altogether. 12 of the survivors died in air crashes within 15 months of the raid. 2 survivors were separated from the USAAF in 1944 due to the severity of their injuries. 6. The 17th Bomb Group, from which the Doolittle Raiders had been recruited, received replacement crews and transferred to Barksdale Army Air Field in June 1942, where it converted to Martin B-26 Marauder medium bombers. In November 1942, it deployed overseas to North Africa, where it operated in the Mediterranean theater of operations with the 12th Air Force for the remainder of the war. Zhejiangjiangxi Campaign. Main article, Zhejiangjiangxi Campaign. After the raid, the Japanese Imperial Army began the Zhejiangjiangxi Campaign, also known as Operation Seigo, to prevent these eastern coastal provinces of China from being used again for an attack on Japan and to take revenge on the Chinese people. An area of some 20,000 sq.mi, 50,000 km2, was laid waste. Like a swarm of locusts, they left behind nothing but destruction and chaos. Eyewitness Father Wendelin Dunker wrote, 2. The Japanese killed an estimated 10,000 Chinese civilians during their search for Doolittle's men. 50. People who aided the airmen were tortured before they were killed. Father Dunker wrote of the destruction of the town of Aihuang. They shot any man, woman, child, cow, hog, or just about anything that moved. They raped any woman from the ages of 10-65, and before burning the town they thoroughly looted it. None of the humans shot were buried either. 2. The Japanese entered Nanchang, Jiangxi, population 50,000 on June 11, beginning a reign of terror so horrendous that missionaries would later dub it the Rape of Nanchang, evoking memories of the infamous rape of Nanjing 5 years before. Less than a month later, the Japanese forces put what remained of the city to the torch. This planned burning was carried on for 3 days, one Chinese newspaper reported, and the city of Nanchang became charred earth. 2. When Japanese troops moved out of the Zhejiang and Jiangxi areas in mid-August, they left behind a trail of devastation. Chinese estimates put the civilian death toll at 250,000. The Imperial Japanese Army had also spread cholera, typhoid, plague-infected fleas, and dysentery pathogens. The Japanese Biological Warfare Unit 731 brought almost 300 pounds, 140 kg, of paratyphoid and anthrax to be left in contaminated food and contaminated wells with the withdrawal of the army from areas around Yushin, Qinhua, and Futzin. Around 1,700 Japanese troops died out of a total 10,000 Japanese soldiers who fell ill with disease when their biological weapons attack rebounded on their own forces. 50-152. Shunroku Hata, the commander of Japanese forces involved in the massacre of the 250,000 Chinese civilians, was sentenced in 1948 in part due to his failure to prevent atrocities. He was given a life sentence but was paroled in 1954, 53.